Okay, hello and welcome to my very first Magic the Gathering video. My name is Jonathan and I'm mainly a Pauper player. I'm no expert, but I really like looking at different brews and making my own brews and trying to improve them over time. And for this first video, I'd like to introduce my deck, which I call Filigree Tron. For those who don't know, Tron is an archetype of decks which use the so-called Tron lands. They are actually called the Urza's Tower, Urza's Power Plant and Urza's Mine. And the point of these lands is essentially that when you have one of each in play, they all produce a ton of mana. So the tower will produce 3 mana, the power plant will produce 2, and the mine will also produce 2 mana. So you can get a ton of mana with only these 3 lands in play. And then I also call it Filigree Tron because I played the new cool downshifted Filigree Familiar, which used to be an uncommon, but in Commander Legends is now a common, so we can use it. But I will talk more about this card later. So now I'll talk a bit about the inspiration for my deck, and it's inspired by an archetype called Mud, which is a nickname for decks running mostly colorless spells and artifacts. This deck right here is played by the Hellmaker, and as you can see it has mostly colorless spells. And the upside to playing colorless spells is that you can play some really cool utility lands instead of normal color producing lands. So you have the Desert, which allows us to actually damage the opponent's creatures after they at the end of combat. Quicksand, which does the same job, but it can also deal damage before the opposing creature deals damage, but it can't target flyers. This deck also runs the Haunted Fangraph, which can return creatures from the graveyard to our hand, but I don't run it in my deck because I run other spells instead. So my deck is actually running quite a bit more colored spells, which are really useful. So I've kind of moved away from the totally colorless archetype, but I still run 4 Desert and 2 Quicksand as great utility lands, which can buy us time to find Tron lands. And as in almost all Tron decks, the first plan of action is to assemble all the Tron pieces. And to do that, we have these 8 card rights here, which are key cards in finding the Tron lands. So Ancient Stirrings costs 1 green mana. It lets us look at the top 5 cards and reveal a colorless card and put them in our hand. And all lands are actually colorless, so we can find any land with this card, and also most of the creatures in our deck. Crop Rotation is a very powerful card. It costs 1 green, and it also has an extra cost of us sacrificing a land. But when you do that, you can search for any land in your deck, put that card onto the battlefield. So if you have 2 Tron lands, like the tower and a power plant, and another land in play, then you can sacrifice the non-Tron land and go find the last missing piece and get a ton of mana that way. So it's a very powerful card in this deck, and it's a must-have, I think. Even this brew with mostly colorless spells run it as well. Because we are running quite a bit of colored spells, we need ways to get colored mana. For that reason, we have the 2 Rugged Highlands, which are basically a green and red land. It enters the battlefield tapped, but we gain 1 life, so which is pretty good. Cave of Temptation can produce any colored mana with the help of another land. So you pay 1 and tap it and add 1 mana of any color. It also has great later game uses because you can pay 4 sacrifices, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creatures. So you can make some really big creatures with this. For more color fixing and ways to dig through our deck, we have 2 Chromatic Star, which costs 1 mana. It's an artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it, so add 1 mana of any color. And when it's put into graveyard, you also draw a card. So we can fix your mana with this, and you also get to draw a card, hopefully finding some more Tron lands. Prophetic Prison does kind of the same thing, but it stays on the battlefield. So when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And then you can also pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana value color. So we run 4 of these because they're extremely useful. Then we have 4 Bonder's Ornament, which is a great addition to this deck. It ramps your mana, so you pay 3 and to play it, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You can also use it to draw cards, which is why it is so very powerful. Then we have 4 cards which are basically instant speed interaction to buy us time and to kill the opponent's stuff. So Pulse of Marasa is a way for us to return a target creature or land card from the graveyard to our hand and also gain us 6 life. So it's a very powerful card in that way and can really buy us a turn to find the lands we need. Complete Disregard is a colorless spell. It costs 1 black mana, but it is devoid, so it's actually counted as colorless, so you can find it with Ancient Stirrings. And it allows us to exile a target creature with power 3 or less, which is great because that means the opponent can't, say, return that creature from the graveyard to their hand, which is really good in some cases. It can also kill the famous Guardian of the Guild Pact, which has protection for monocolored, and it's used in quite a lot of decks. This actually has no color, so this can kill the Guardian of the Guild Pact. We have the new cool Sweeper in the Pauper format, which is the Fiery Cannonade. It deals 2 damage to each non-pirate creature. Then we have the Abrade, which is an instant speed removal, or it can destroy an artifact. Most notably, it can destroy opposing Bonder's Ornament, because the ornament has a symmetrical effect. So if both players control an ornament, then the draw ability will affect both players. So we can remove the opponent's ornament or any other artifact. Then we have the namesake of the deck, the Filigree Familiar, which is a really cool new addition. When it enters the battlefield, we gain 2 life, and when it dies, we get to draw a card. So it's also a way to buy us time, and it's a great blocker even if it dies and the opposing creature lives. You still get to draw a card, so it's very valuable that way. Then we also have our big bad threats here. So we have the Self-Assembler, which is a great card advantage beater. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for another of these Self-Assemblers and put it in your hand. So you can just continually churn out these big threats, and opponent has to deal with them. 4/4 is a big body in Pauper. We also have the Wretched Griff, which is another card advantage creature. It costs 7 mana, it's a 3/4 flyer. When you cast it, you get to draw a card. So even before this actually resolves and hits the battlefield, you get to draw a card from it. There's a really cool interaction with this card and the Filigree Familiar because of the Emerge ability this card has. Emerge allows you to sacrifice another creature, preferably the Filigree Familiar, and you can then subtract the cost of the Filigree Familiar, so you can subtract 3 from the Emerge cost and pay that cost instead. So if you have a Filigree Familiar on the battlefield, you can pay 2 and a blue, sacrifice the Familiar, and cast the Wretched Griff. So when you sacrifice the Familiar, you get to draw a card. When you cast the Griff, you get to draw a card. And then you end up with a 3/4 flyer on the battlefield. And you can do this with actually only 3 lands in play. So even if you don't find the Tron lands, you can still produce threats and draw through our deck, which is great. It's really what this deck needs, I think. Then we have 2 top-end creatures, which are the Ulanog's Crusher, which are the biggest, baddest beaters in all of Pauper. It has Annihilator 2, so when it attacks, the opponent has to sacrifice 2 permanents. And it's not when it deals damage to the opponent, it's just when it attacks. So as soon as you tap it, the ability will trigger and the opponent has to sacrifice things. Then we have some really useful big mana plays here, big mana sorceries. So Russian Knowledge is a 5 mana sorcery. It allows us to draw cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control. And we have some really high mana cost here, so Crusher is 8, Griff is 7, Self-Assembly is 5, so you can draw a ton of cards with this. Only if you have something in play, of course. We have the Carvex Torch, which is a great finisher if we need to just burn the opponent out, get in those few last points of damage. Also, it's very hard to counter, because when it's on stack, spells that target it cost 2 more to cast. So it's really great against the blue decks, which oftentimes hold up 2 mana for a counterspell. So a counterspell would actually cost 4 mana instead of 2 to counter this. And it deals X damage to any target, so 1 red and X, and we can choose the amount X. So with Tron lands in play, sometimes we can do 20 damage to the opponent. It's really ridiculous. Rolling Thunder is similar to Carvex Torch, but instead of only dealing damage to one target, we can deal damage to any number of targets divided as we choose. But it does cost 2 red and then X. Yeah, so those are our main deck cards. Okay, so moving on to the sideboard, we have some different packages to deal with different decks in the format. So we have 3 Relic of Progenitus, which allows us to force the opponent to exile a card from their graveyard. We can also pay 1, exile the Relic, and exile all cards from all graveyards, and also draw a card. Against decks which are very fast, we have 1 extra Pulse of Marasa and 2 Moments Peace, a card which prevents all combat damage this turn. It also has flashbacks for 2 and a green, so you can play it once again from our graveyard. We have another complete disregard against opposing Tron decks and Affinity decks. We have 2 Cleansing Wildfire. This card destroys a target land, allows the controller of the land to search their library for a basic land card and put it onto battlefield tapped. And then we also get to draw a card. So it's a great way to deal with opposing Tron lands. We can remove their Tron lands and reduce their mana resources, and they have to find a basic land instead, which sometimes they can't. It's also good against Affinity, because they run a lot of artifact lands which are non-basic, and they also often have a small number of basic lands. Gorilla Shaman is another way to deal with artifacts, and especially Affinity. It's a 1 mana 1/1 creature. It has an activated ability which we can reuse, and it allows us to destroy target non-creature artifact with converted mana cost X. And because artifact lands have a converted mana cost of 0, we can actually pay 0/0/1, so only 1 mana to destroy Affinity lands, which is really great. We have another Carvex Torch for strategies using Stonehorn Dignitary or other fog effects. If we need to just deal those last points of damage and we can't use the combat step. We have some more sweepers, the Fiery Cannonade, which I talked about before, and another Rolling Thunder, which we can also use as a way to deal damage directly to the opponent. For decks which are low on removal and other interaction, we have 1 extra Ulamog's Crusher, because if this hits the battlefield and the opponent can't deal with it, it's just a matter of time before they die, unless there is some other way to kill us. So that's my deck. I will attempt to play this in a league. I have never played in a league before, so I'm very excited. I hope to learn quite a bit by playing a league and also commentating on my plays. And hopefully also I have some thoughts after the league about what can be improved. This is not a meta deck at all. I have played it in tournament practice rooms on MTGO, and it has done quite well. Sometimes it wins extremely fast. So I hope it can at least produce a few wins. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the league. Okay, so I decided to do some last minute changes because I realized I need to have some game against Hexproof. So I decided to bring in 2 Serene Hearts. I will cut 1 Pulse of Marasa. I don't think we need 2 copies. And 1 Complete Disregard, because I don't think we actually need to deal with Guardian of the Guildpact too much. And that's it. Thank you.